Welcome everyone to today's interview. Today we're talking to journalists from the Post and Courier as well as NASCAR.com and other places. David Caraviello. David, how are you doing?
I'm great, Brandon. How are you, man?
Doing good. I got that last name, correct?
It's close enough.
Okay.
Listen, it's every Saturday. If it's in the ballpark, I'm not going to complain.
See, in school they always told us that like if you should just say something really just strong and say it really fast, no one will question you. But when you're recording something
with the speed.
David, I guess first jumping into it, when did you first get into journalism?
It's the only thing I've ever really done professionally. I started working at the paper in high school, just doing, typing in box scores and covered high school games, that sort of thing. Worked there summers in college, covered minor league baseball and American Legion baseball, and it's the only thing I've ever done, Brandon. Got my first job out of college was as a sports writer and editor in Aiken, South Carolina. Moved from there to Spartanburg, where I was covering the Gamecocks, and got a call to come back to the paper in late '99. That was back when all the newspapers in the region had a NASCAR writer, had a dedicated NASCAR writer. I mean, whether it was Charleston, Greenville, Birmingham, Atlanta, Charlotte, we all had guys who covered 15 to 17 races a year, got to everything they could drive to. You wrote weekly features and weekly packages and really sort of kind of, gave something local for that sort of auto racing fan to sort of really kind of read. But, all that's gone now. But I was very lucky into it at a time when the local papers put a lot of resources covering racing. Probably because the local car manufacturers bought a lot of ads for it, I would guess. But I did racing from, 99 through 2014. So I did racing longer than I did anything else, which is kind of unbelievable for a guy who never had seen a race until he was paid to cover one.
Oh, wow.
The first I ever covered was the first race I ever saw. And the idea that I was in that industry, a decade plus is kind of crazy, but that's how it turned out.
Yeah, I think a lot of for the younger fans watching this, they're probably most familiar with newspaper being something where you just go to the newspaper's website. But I know for me, we didn't really get internet at our house until probably 2006 or so. So growing up, that was, the day after the race, if you didn't get to see the results or whatever, you had to go Monday morning, go pick up a paper. And I remember every Monday reading and being like, all right, what happened in the race? What's the write-up? And then, as well as Friday, getting that preview. So, for, like you said, that late 90s, early 2000s, for a lot of people, you were the person they were relying on to see what was the main story, where did everyone finish and all that kind of stuff.
It was very, the races we didn't go to when I was at the paper the first time, we used copy for. Obviously the Post and Courier was not going to Sonoma or Loudon or any of these places. So we used wire copy for that. But that paled in comparison to what we produced when we had a guy there. And, if you were going on the paper's dime to Atlanta or Bristol or Talladega, you felt like you had to sort of justify it a little bit. Yeah. And I look back at some of those Sunday sections and the amount of work. I mean, we would have a page and a half of NASCAR copy. I mean, you would have a lead, you would have a notebook, you would have a bush race story. I would write a column. You'd have, 4 to 5 pieces of just NASCAR stuff. That's back when the papers were much bigger. It's a whole different ballgame now. But, it's unbelievable to think of the amount of copy you would turn out for a Sunday paper, writing for a local newspaper then, as opposed to now where, the newspapers are so strapped that, you a wire story and you get a rundown, but most people probably get their information online.
Yeah.
But back then, man, you're too young to remember this, but there was a time when, the Boston Globe pioneered this practice of emptying the notebook on Sunday. It's a big paper. You had a whole page dedicated to each sport. And a lot of newspapers sort of tried to copy that a little bit. And, we did over a page car when I was at a race. And the amount of, I look back and crazy the amount of copy we were turning out then for the Charleston reader. None of this was, very little of this was showing up online back in 2001, 2002. do. So it was for people for whom the paper showed up at their front doorstep.
Mm-hmm. So, most listeners will recognize you from your NASCAR coverage, as well as covering the South Carolina Gamecocks. When it comes to covering multiple sports, is there a difference in the approach, or is it just as simple as, a good story is a good story?
A good story is a good story. Where it differs is the access.
Mm-hmm.
I was really lucky to work in NASCAR at a time where you could literally, stop drivers on their way back to their hauler and get a few with them. That's changed a little bit, but the access in NASCAR when I was there was incredible, especially because, if you were one of the local guys, one of the regular guys, and when I was working for NASCAR.com, I was doing, 30 races a year or something like that.
Yeah.
And so you were lucky enough to where they saw your face every week. And if you needed time with somebody, even if it was walking from their car to their motorhome, more times than not, you got it. Mm-hmm. And that allowed you to write really good, personal, deep stories. That was harder those kinds of stories are much harder to write when you're covering something like college sports, where the players are very protected. And you get a couple of players a week, and it's the head coach who decides who you get. Maybe you get an assistant coach. Maybe you get no assistant coaches all year. Nick Saban pioneered this programs speaking with one voice kind of philosophy. And a lot of schools have kind of mirrored that. And it really cuts down on the number of people you can talk to. It really cuts down on the breadth of story you're able to tell. And it makes it really, really harder to kind of accurately going on. NASCAR was a whole different ballgame. I remember when I started NASCAR, Brandon, a buddy of mine named Michael Carvel, who had covered it for the Atlanta paper, told me that NASCAR was the great secret of sports writing, that there was so much access. There was so much untapped stuff there to write about. And he was right. It was a blast. But in terms of telling stories, I told stories the same way in NASCAR that I told them covering the Gamecocks. I write more, as a freelancer now, I write more real estate than anything else. And I write stories the exact same way. You find the best angle and you write the heck out of it. And that's no different whether you're covering guys going fast in race cars, or whether you're covering college football, whether you're covering anything else.
Awesome. During your NASCAR career, is there, you covered tons of stories, but is there one or two that really stand out as your favorite? Either you just, love writing them, or just to this day, you still think about, wow, this happened, or whatever.
It's not a fond memory, but being on site on, the Daytona 500 in 2001, everything about that aftermath. I can remember it like it was yesterday. And not just not just that day. I can remember how it was in Rockingham the next week when we were having all those press conferences in a temporary tent set up with icicles hanging on the off the edges of the tents. I can remember Atlanta the following week and what it felt like to be there when Kevin Harvick won and how emotional that aftermath. That was a 3 or 4 week span where so much of it still is so vivid in my mind because you were covering the biggest. It's the only time I've ever been able to cover the biggest story in the world, which is what Mark's crash was. And so much of that stands out. But from a positive standpoint, the thing I take away from my time in NASCAR is that I had the honor and the pleasure and the good timing of being able to cover the breadth of Jimmy Johnson's career. I didn't get to cover the very end of it, but I covered him through 6 championships, covered him coming up when nobody knew who he was. And I never have come across a guy who was a better human being as a superstar athlete than Jimmy Johnson. And if more people got to know the perception of him, I think would have been vastly different in the fan base. He was as genuine a guy on the last day I covered him as he was on the first day I covered him. And being able to watch him win, 6 championships, to see him sort of remain the same grounded, accessible person through all that was incredible. And to be able to cover Jimmy Johnson is undoubtedly the highlight of my writing career.
Yeah, I think so many people, whenever you're dominating, no one wants to pull for you. And I know even for me, like when he was dominating, I was mad because he's beating all of my favorite drivers. But then, towards the end of his career, you start hearing all these stories and you start realizing, man, this guy was like, why was I rooting against this guy? Like, he's so talented, he's such a nice guy, and you're like, why did I spend so much time being angry that he was dominating?
No, you're right. You're right. I think he was so polished
Hmm.
that it rubbed people the wrong way. Strangely enough, made everybody think he came up rich, that he bought his way into the
Yeah.
ride. You know, somehow a product of money, and everybody now everybody knows the Jimmy Johnson backstory, and that none of that was even close to the truth.
Mm.
And this is a guy who broke his hand surfing on top of a golf cart like the third year into the sport. So I mean, he was the same Jimmy Johnson through 6 championships that he was the first weekend. I remember seeing him at the track when nobody knew who this guy was, and that was a pleasure to cover him through all that.
As I was telling you before the interview, one of my favorite pieces of yours was the article covering the history and the demolition of Summerville Speedway in Summerville, South Carolina. Can you tell us a little bit about the Speedway and what led to you wanting to write the article?
Yeah, Brandon, when I covered racing for the paper, late '99 to 2007, Summerville Speedway was the only short track in the Low Country.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was the cornerstone of kind of NASCAR culture for people here. I mean, it was a place where people's fathers had raced. It was a place where people's grandfathers had raced. And there was a lot of family lineage that went into there. Back decades earlier, there had been another track down Highway 17. I think there had been a third track in the Charleston area. But over time, those all disappeared. And Summerville was, the last one standing for a very long time. And it was a place where, it was a routine for guys to go on weekend nights, on Saturday nights and compete. Like all short tracks, they struggled at the gate toward the end.
Mm-hmm.
But for the competitors there, it was still the same kind of place it had always been. And it got sold in 2000. I think it closed in 2004, and it got sold to a developer who turned it into part of a neighborhood. It was a few years ago where I wondered if those guys who had raced at Summerville were still racing. Mm-hmm. And the paper was kind enough to let me pursue that. And it turns out they all were. I mean, they were just trucking their cars up to Dillon or Florence or Gaffney or, some other place on Friday or Saturday nights now. But the vast majority of guys who I remembered from Summerville, who I reached out to were still competing somewhere. Mm-hmm. And, they were just having to go a much longer way to do it, which is a little heartening, honestly. I went into that expecting everybody to say they'd given it up. Yeah. And that was not the case at all. These guys were still as kind of dyed-in-the-wool racers that they had always been. They just were having to do it somewhere else because their local track was going.
Yeah, it's weird because, for me growing up, I would hear all these stories from, my granddad, my dad, and I grew up every week going to, a drag strip or, a mud bog or, flat track motorcycles or whatever. And as I started getting older, I realized that there was just so much of racing disappearing. So like we'd be at school and you'd have all my friends talking about, Clemson's football game that weekend or, the Gamecocks. And I'd be sitting there being like, hey, Truex won another Busch race. And it was just kind of weird seeing how a lot of that stuff has just disappeared. And I feel like, except for Darlington, you really don't see South Carolina as this hub of NASCAR that it once was.
No, man, you're exactly right. I mean, you think about when I started, Jason Keller was from Greenville. Mm-hmm. You might have had one or two other guys who were kind of from the state who were in the lower ranks of NASCAR, but you would have had David Pearson and Cale Yarborough and those guys come up. Spartanburg at one time was as big to NASCAR as Charlotte is now. Yeah. There's a long story there about how, they thought they were going to build what a super speedway in Spartanburg County, but there was some resistance to it within the local government. So Bill France Jr. took it somewhere else. And there's a lot of sort of what ifs in Spartanburg over that. But you're right. I mean, South Carolina used to be as important to NASCAR as any other state. Louise Smith was from here. Mm-hmm. Joe Littlejohn, who was a pioneering promoter, back in the day, was from here. And there are tons of connections, but they're all from years in the past, unfortunately. And you're right. Outside of Darlington, which does a really good job maximizing its history, there's not a whole lot left, and you don't even see the drivers coming out of here anymore, because now everybody sort of has to move someplace. So that's the best kind of, whether it's Atlanta or, Charlotte or somewhere else, sort of like race against that best week-to-week competition to kind of get themselves known. And, it's totally sort of changed the landscape of a driver thinking he can kind of come through the ranks by starting at a local track, regardless of where that local track is.
And finally, what advice would you give to folks out there who are looking to enter the world of journalism?
Wow. We talked about earlier, Brandon, that, I've covered a lot of different stuff. I ended up in NASCAR by accident. I never would have gotten into covering racing by choosing. And it turned out to be, the thing I spent the longest in, enjoyed tremendously, made tons of friends in it. And, I don't miss the week-to-week grind of covering racing, but I miss a lot of the people who were in it. And the number one thing I tell people is don't limit yourself. I knew a lot of guys who covered NASCAR because they just wanted to be around NASCAR. There's nothing wrong with that, but the writing has to kind of come first, or whatever sort of the digital journalism, whatever it is, whatever your medium is, kind of has to come first. And if you're good at doing that in racing, you'll be good at doing that in any other area of subject matter. And I saw too many people limit themselves, Brandon, just, because, they only wanted to cover racing and they weren't interested in, maybe they had opportunities to broaden their career by doing something that was with a different sport or a different area of journalism. But they just wanted to be at the racetrack every week. And I saw guys sleep in their cars because they just wanted to be around the track every weekend. And that was that. I can't relate to that. I came up believing you don't do anything for free. You get people to pay you, and you sort of follow the best thing for your career. Would I have loved to go to the NCAA basketball tournament every year? Yes, I've been to 4 of them. I'll take it. But it's don't limit yourself. If racing is so near and dear to you, that's the only thing you want to do. See if there are other things in racing besides journalism that you might be able to get a foothold in. If you're in it for the journalism, don't let racing limit or blind you to other opportunities. And, the most successful people I've known in this business have been guys who have sort of floated from one thing to another. And there's nothing wrong with covering something else for a time. Racing's not going anywhere. You can leave it and come back to it, and just don't limit your options by being so dogged that you only want to do one thing.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that advice, David, and thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Brandon, anytime, man.